We have previously discussed that the Constitution is the second government for the United States, and that the previous government had been created under a document called the Articles of Confederation. But what exactly were the Articles and why were they replaced? The Articles of Confederation had been written by the Continental Congress and presented to the states by 1777, but they were not ratified by the separate states until March of 1781, prior to the siege at Yorktown and the wrapping up of the American Revolution. They would remain the American form of government until their replacement by the current Constitution in 1789. The Articles have been criticized by historians as too weak to bind the fledgling nation together, but they did provide an invaluable experience in nation building and acted as a stepping stone to the Constitution, which has served as the U.S.'s form of government for over 200 years. The first major way in which the Articles differed from the Constitution is in that the Articles set up a confederacy of states. As you learned in the previous unit, a confederacy or confederation is a loose alliance of states that is created for the purpose of increased or easier trade, or perhaps as a military alliance for mutual defense. The states cede some of their sovereignty to a central government, but the vast majority of power remains in the state governments. Recall that early in American history, there was not really a sense of being an American, but of being a Virginian or a New Yorker or a South Carolinian. The states had their own cultures, traditions, religions, and in many cases, ethnic backgrounds. At that time, it seemed that a confederate form of government would work best to ensure that the individual states retained sovereignty over their own affairs, but issues developed over time. For one, the Continental Congress had no way of forcing the states to fund it or the legislation it passed. It could only requisition or ask for money from the states. With virtually no way of paying for its own legislation or the debts incurred during the war, the national government was virtually powerless. A second issue was that of the matter of representation of the states within Congress. Each state, no matter its population, wealth, or tax contribution, received one vote in the Confederation Congress. Tensions between states rose because large states like Virginia and Pennsylvania, which may have contributed more in terms of taxes and had larger and more diverse populations, possessed the same voting power as smaller states like Connecticut and Rhode Island. A third problem for the national government came in the form of no executive. Even though under the Constitution the president is weaker than Congress, the president has an advantage known as the bully pulpit. The president's voice is the loudest in all of the American government, and he or she can use that voice to advocate policy or set a tone or direction for the country. Without an executive, none of this was possible. Yet another matter for the national government under the Articles was the lack of commercial regulatory powers vested in the national government. Under the Articles, trade wars or even actual shooting wars between states was conceivable. Problems specifically arose between the states of New York and New Jersey about the ports in New York Harbor. These problems didn't go unnoticed, and many representatives, statesmen, and leaders began to argue for revisions to the Articles of Confederation. Any such revisions or amendments would require the consent of all 13 states, and this was no easy task. A group of representatives from 5 states met in Annapolis, Maryland, to begin looking into the issues associated with the Articles of Confederation. Though they could not legally amend the Articles without the presence of representatives from the other 8 states, the representatives in Annapolis agreed that governance under the Articles, as they were currently constituted, could not continue on, so they agreed to meet again in a few months in Philadelphia. 55 representatives, known as the Framers, came from 12 of the 13 states. Rhode Island chose not to attend, and they met in Philadelphia in 1787 to look into amending the Articles of Confederation. However, any amendments passed by this body would not be legal without Rhode Island's consent, but that didn't stop them from moving forward. Among the delegates in attendance were Benjamin Franklin, who was 81 at the time, George Washington, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and George Mason. The average age of the delegates was an astoundingly young 42 years old. Fairly quickly, many of the delegates realized that the articles could not be salvaged, and instead a new document should be drawn up to bring the states into a closer union. George Washington was chosen to lead the delegates as the president of what would come to be known as the Constitutional Convention. Soon the delegates would divide into two major factions: those that favored a new document and believed the proceedings were necessary even if they weren't technically legal, and those who argued the sovereignty of the states should be preserved in the Articles of Confederation and that the rule of law must be observed.